In this video, we're going to take a look at Organic Studio's Willow Green. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is the kind of green that gets non-green lovers to start loving, not just liking green. A green the way I like them. There is some tone variation so slight that I'm not even going to bother really mentioning it. Shading, yes, yes, and yes to the camouflage shading. If you don't like shading, don't tell me about it today, because this ink is too nice to have to hear someone tell me that they don't like shading. I'm telling you now it shades a lot, so you don't have to watch the video and are able to leave happy, and let us all be happy with this amazing shading ink. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Levenger TrueWriter with a broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the standard Ahab nib, we get a beautiful green tone. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade. Now, this is some of the least shading that we're going to see. It is pretty good. This is not the full camouflage shading. This is the yes, yes, and yes part. It looks good. It behaves well. I really like it. I do think it does get better from here. Looking at the gold nib, don't be confused by this very dark tone that's coming out in the beginning. This is going to level out on the second line, and you're going to start to see the tone this ink really is. So about the same. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade, and it does shade here better than it did with the standard Ahab nib. I don't know why the gold nib shouldn't make the ink shade better, but in this case, it is. Looking at the Fude nib, we get about the same tone that we have with the gold and the standard Ahab nib. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade very well. Look at the camouflage on the page. My God, that's beautiful. Now look, it is not shading as well as like the Noodler's Army. There's a few different green inks that definitely shade better, but this one is beautiful. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting. Just a great performance. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Noodler's Ahab with an extra fine nib. A Noodler's Ahab with a medium nib. A Noodler's Ahab with a 1.1 stub nib. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the standard Ahab nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade, and I think it is shading here, shockingly, even better than it did on the Clairfontaine. I really like what I'm seeing here, and I think this is doing an absolutely amazing job. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone that we had with the font or with the standard Ahab on this paper. We get the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread. We do get shading, and shading just as nice as you had just seen with the standard Ahab nib. Really, really doing so nice. I am incredibly happy with this ink. Looking at the Fude nib, we get the same tone that we had with the gold and with the standard Ahab on this page. We get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread. We do get shading. Now, the shading is not as good as it was on the Clairfontaine or as it was with the gold nib on this paper. But you do see it shading in and out of lighter and midtones constantly, and it does look really good, especially with those few very dark spots. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, we get no ghosting, we get beautiful performance. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the standard Ahab nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, we get no spread, we get a little shading. It's not tons. More shading than this paper typically gives. Not as standout as it was on the last paper or on the Clairfontaine, but it is still shading and it is doing very nicely. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone as the standard Ahab. We get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feather, no spread. The shading is even better than it was on with the standard nib, about how it was going, just not quite as dark as it was with the Clairfontaine, but still doing good. Looking at the Fude nib, we get the same tone that we had with the gold and with the standard Ahab. We get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It's hard to say feathering because of the way I was writing and the brush effect, but I really do think we're seeing some feathering in the M and G of might. I think we see some feathering at the beginning of who. I think we see a little bit of spread and just a little bit of shading. Not a great performance on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, now it does dot through with the gold and the Fude, not the standard Ahab, but nothing bled through and touched the page underneath. In fact, I think you could write on the back of this page. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the standard Ahab nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get shading. Now the shading's not huge and not stand out, but just choose one word, like we'll say dimensions. And you see that it goes lighter into a little darker at the M, lighter at the E, darker at the N, lighter at the S, darker at the I. It's back and forth. Very slight, but very constant. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone as the standard Ahab, same tone as on Clairfontaine. This ink is so incredibly consistent. Oh my God, it's nice. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade, even better than it did with the standard Ahab, which has been a constant through these writings, and it has constantly looked good. Looking at the Fude nib, we get the same tone that we had with the gold and with the standard Ahab, and the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We do see a little bit of feathering that's happening in the word stated. You see it in the end of the word English, both on the top line. You see it in mathematics, second line. We're getting a little bit of feathering. We're not getting any spread. We are getting little bits of shading. Actually, I say little bits. We're getting shading at about the same level. I'm just a little distracted with some of the wiggly line. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it got very deep into the paper with the Fude, with the gold, and even with the standard. However, I think you could use the back of the page for the standard Ahab. I probably wouldn't for the gold or for the Fude nib. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Monteverde Aeronite. Here is Noodler's Forest Green. Here is Pen BBS number 224. Here is Private Reserve Sherwood Green. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the standard Ahab nib, we get the same tone that we did on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering. We do get some spread. We don't get any shading, which in this case is a good thing. Helps a little bit here. I'm hoping it holds up. Looking at the gold nib, we get the same tone that we had with the standard Ahab, same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering, do get spread, do not get shading, which I am holding on to all hope. I lied. I see the H in published and the N in reception are a bit darker, and I think I'm about to see some bleed spots. Damn it. Looking at the Fude nib, we get, holy crap, a darker tone than we did with the gold, or the Fude, and it's a little bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. We do get feather, we do get spread, we do get no shading, but it being darker and wetter has me a little worried. I'm hoping this holds out for as good as the ink has been this entire time. Looking at the page underneath, there were only 2 little dots with the Fude nib that did bleed through and touch the page underneath. We see the back of the page has a ton of ghosting. You probably can't write back here. While it's nice to compare it to other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is an orange ink by Diatramentis, their red orange. Here is a purple ink by Diamine, their lavender. Here is a black ink by Noodler's dark matter. Here is a red ink by Zenzoi, their red. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the standard Ahab nib, we get about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering, which we generally expect. We do get spread, which we generally expect. We do not get shading, which we don't generally expect. This is why I don't like copy paper. It has taken what has been a beautiful ink and made it just a light green. Looking at the gold nib, we have about the same tone that we had with the standard Ahab. We do get feather, we do get spread, we get a couple moments where shading does show up. You see it in his, you see it in greatest, directly underneath greatest, you see it in not, you see it in until, a little above it. It's there and constantly. Not something that happens a whole lot with the copy paper. I'm really hoping that this is not horrible news for this paper, because this isn't bad. Looking at the Fude nib, it is a little darker than it was with the gold or the standard Ahab, a little darker than we had on the Clairfontaine, kind of like what happened with the last paper. We do get feathering, we do get spread, we do not get shading, we get what 20-pound paper does to beautiful inks and makes it just a color on a page. It's taken all of the life out of this ink and just said, here's a green. Looking at the back of the page. Now, there's a lot of ghosting, so you probably don't want to write back here, but listen to this. Nothing bled through to the page underneath. This ink is a hero. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? This ink is so consistent and boring, where boring is predictable and predictable is good. So boring, it can go in any pen and therefore must be a dealer's choice. Which, back when I first said that, I immediately thought of what a huge compliment that is to an ink that you don't have to worry about how you pair an ink with a pen. And I feel like it's constantly come off as just nothing stands out special. It's that the ink is so special that it doesn't matter what you put it in. And isn't that what you really want in just about any ink? I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to be able to follow me over on Instagram, I'm there as an ink guy. Thanks for watching.